This is an Introduction to English Grammar Part 2 about historical prescriptivism. This is for a class at the University of Utah, and my name is Karen. Okay, we talked last time about 3 different types of grammar. This is just a quick review for you. Those 3 different types of grammar: mental grammar, descriptive grammar, and prescriptive grammar. Prescriptive grammar is the type of grammar that people use when they're trying to tell you what you should or should not do. Descriptive grammar is a grammar that linguists use that describes what it is that people actually do in a language. And mental grammar is the grammar that's inside of your head that tells you how to produce language and also tells you whether or not a sentence is correct or incorrect, grammatical or ungrammatical. The goals for this presentation are that you'll be able to explain the conditions under which prescriptive rules were created. You'll also be able to list the 2 main ways that prescriptive rules were formed: logic and analogy. You will also be able to give 1 example of a rule that was created in each of these ways. Okay, the first thing to know is that language changes. Okay, all aspects of language change continuously, and changes that happen in different places, like different places in terms of geography, give rise to different forms of a language or dialects. This is one of the reasons for different accents, grammars, etc. Okay, here is an example from Standard American English of a grammatical change that's happened. So this is our pronoun system. In our pronoun system, you can see that the first person singular pronoun is I. Okay? If we take the first person plural pronoun, meaning me and someone else, we say we. Okay? You can see in the second person that we have the same pronoun for you singular, meaning 1 person, and you plural, meaning 2 people, 2 or more people. Okay, this is an older English version of the pronoun paradigm, and you can see here that there was an additional pronoun that used to exist in the second person singular paradigm. We used to have a pronoun that was thou. So when you were talking to someone, you might say, you look very nice today, or you might say thou, and then finish that in the older English version as well. The distinction exists in many languages. We call this a TV or a tu-vu distinction in their second person forms. For example, Serbian has the distinction between T and V. Spanish has the distinction between tu and usted. German has the distinction between du and sie. French also has the distinction. They actually are the tu-vu distinction. The T form is used with people of the same status as the speaker or lower. This is sometimes referred to as the familiar form. And the V form is used with people of higher status, or is the formal form. In English, the distinction has mostly gone away. We don't use thou very often. So now when we use thou, it sounds like a much more formal form because it's old. Okay, something that's important for you to know as we talk about prescriptivism has to do with the other things that were going on in the world at that time. So during the 18th century, the Age of Reason, writers decided that we needed to standardize the English language. So here in England, there are people who speak many different forms of English, and now that we have the printing press and we're starting to write things down, there needs to be some way to standardize all of those forms so that if you're from the very southern part of England or the very northern part of England, you can read the same thing and know what that means, instead of having each group of people write it down in the way they are speaking it. Okay, so this is one of the things that gives rise to prescriptivism. Okay, here are some of the grammarians who wrote sort of the famous English prescriptive grammars, and then the years listed that they wrote those in. Okay, so how did they decide what to do? So here in England, people are speaking all kinds of English, and how do we decide what things we should speak as acceptable or not acceptable? Okay, prescriptivists generally believe that language should be fixed and unchanging. Okay, again, at the time, during the Age of Reason, they're looking around at the universe saying, wow, everything works really logically, so language, it should be logical as well. And the variations among the dialects was disorderly to them. So to correct this problem, they dictated 1 set of rules that would work for everyone. The solution was not to look at forms that people were actually speaking at the time, because they didn't want variation. They wanted to avoid that. So instead, they looked to two sources for their decisions. They looked to logic and analogy. Okay? Here are some examples of logic in prescriptivism. Okay, Bishop Lowth is famous for prescribing the nominative pronoun in comparatives. Comparative is when you're comparing two things to each other. Okay, so for example, this is the grammatically correct way to say this sentence. He is taller than I. The nominative pronoun here is the I. So he is taller than I. Okay, in contrast to what was spoken at the time, which is he is taller than me. Okay. The logic behind this decision is that Bishop Lowth felt that the comparatives with than were actually shorter versions of a longer sentence. And so we should use the same as it would be in the longer sentence. So the longer sentence would be something like, he is taller than I am tall, which means that the ellipted version or the shortened version, he is taller than I. Okay? But there are some logical reasons why they could have gone with the other form. So both forms were in use at the time. Why did they choose one and not the other? Here are some reasons for why we could have gone with the other form. He is taller than me. Okay, the first one is that than is a preposition. In English, many other prepositions are followed by pronouns in the objective case. We call them objects of a preposition. Okay, something we'll talk about later. So here are some examples. He gave the book to me. Were you talking about her? Okay. The second reason is that it's very unusual at the end of a sentence to use the pronoun in the nominative and say I. Okay, therefore it seems logical that to say the sentence, he is taller than me, would be more acceptable because we use me at the end of the sentence. Okay? The other thing is that other languages use it as well. So instead of logic here, analogy, looking to other languages and doing it the same way they do it. And they end with the objective pronoun as well, not the nominative. Okay, here's another prescriptive rule that comes from logic. Okay, Bishop Lowth is also famous for the prescription against double negatives in English. Okay, something like, I don't want nobody to see this book is ungrammatical, where we should say, I don't want anybody to see this book. Okay, Bishop Lowth somehow thought that double negatives worked the same as in mathematics. So if you use two negatives in a sentence, then surely the speaker could not understand that you meant the negative. They would surely think that you meant the positive if you used two negatives. Okay, he thought it made sense to only have one negative element per sentence. Again, this was in contrast to the forms that were being used at the time. And double negatives are widespread in the world's languages with very little confusion. People don't somehow think that this should be a positive because it has two negatives. Here is an example from Spanish. Okay, let's look at some examples of analogy. The 18th century prescriptivists made their decisions about what language forms should be used by looking to the languages they really respected, Classical Greek and Latin. One of the best things about those languages is that since they weren't being spoken regularly, they didn't change. So looking for that order that they were searching for, the fact that the languages didn't change anymore was a real benefit to them. And so they would often look to those languages and say, yeah, we should do it the way Latin does. Okay? Often the prescriptivists tried to make English as Latin-like as possible. However, English is a relative of German. And so instead of following our structural patterns like German, we're now forcing the structural patterns to look like Latin, which is not what they would naturally look like in English. Okay, sorry. Here's an example of analogy used in Latin, or from Latin, that the prescriptivists used against the prohibition of the split infinitive. So here's a very famous sentence from Star Trek. To boldly go where no one has gone before. This is a very famous phrase, and this, according to prescriptivists, would be incorrect because the infinitive to go is split here, split by the word boldly. So instead, we should say something like, to go boldly where no one has gone before. An infinitive means non-finite or timeless. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our chapter on verbs and a little bit in our chapter on nouns as well. Okay? What this means is that we don't have any tense associated with it. It's not past tense or present tense. It just is. Okay? In Latin, infinitives are just one word, and it's not possible to separate them with an adverb like we've had in our sentence. Okay, Bishop Loth may not have realized that in English, to go is not the basic form of the verb. Instead, go is the basic form of the verb. In addition, there seems to be no problem for native speakers with split infinitives. We often think it's better to split the infinitive in terms of how we say something. So I could say, I want to quickly find my keys, which is a split infinitive, instead of, I want to find quickly my keys, or I want quickly to find my keys. Okay? So often we actually prefer the split infinitive in terms of our mental grammar, but our prescriptive grammar tells us that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't split those infinitives. Okay, here's another famous analogy in Latin, or from Latin, the prohibition of stranding a preposition at the end of the sentence. So don't end your sentence with a preposition. These are all sentences that we hear very regularly in English. Who were you talking to? That's the guy I gave the book to. Where are you from? Okay, so in Latin, the preposition always moves along with the rest of the phrase to create sentences like this. To whom were you talking? Which for me, as soon as I move whom, I also want to say speaking to make it more formal. So I would actually prefer, my mental grammar prefers, to whom were you speaking? Okay, the second one, that's the guy to whom I gave the book. Okay, and the third one, from where have you come? I actually find the third one to be the most difficult example, that I have never once wanted to ask someone, oh, from where have you come? Or from whence have you come? Instead of where are you from? So it's very common for us in English, a descriptive grammar would say it's very common for us in English to end a sentence with a preposition, but prescriptivists don't like that. Okay, in German, the language we descended from, preposition stranding is very normal. Okay, so English inherited this from its German ancestor. Here's an example in English or in German. In this case, the prescriptivists just ignored the history of English and decided to make it like Latin, which they liked better. So a summary for us for this presentation, the first thing is that language change, including grammatical change, is a natural process in all languages. Okay, the second thing is that bad grammatical forms, or what we think of as bad grammatical forms now, were in common use before the prescriptive rules that say we shouldn't use them. So if we weren't using those forms when the prescriptivists made the dictionaries, then there would have been no reason to put it in. They only put in rules against or prohibiting forms that they didn't like. Okay? And many prescriptive rules are based on faulty logic or analogy to Latin, despite the fact that English is a Germanic language. Okay? Why this is important to our discussion here, again, has to do with the distinction between what your mental grammar thinks is acceptable and what your prescriptive grammar says is correct or not correct. Okay? So often the prescriptive grammar says you should not do something, but we have been doing it for hundreds of years in English, and so it's common for us to continue doing those forms that are wrong because we hear them and our mental grammar thinks they're perfectly acceptable.